So welcome back, and thanks so much for engaging in our question of the day, which speaks to this interview that we're getting into now. So South Africa's grade 4 learners' comprehension skills have declined, with the country coming last among the 57 countries that were assessed for reading achievement in progress in international reading literacy studies, or the PIRLS. And this has been revealed in the latest report that was released yesterday. Now, over 12,000 grade 4 learners in 321 schools and over 9,000 grade 6 learners in 253 schools wrote the PIRLS 2021 assessment. And this international assessment has been conducted every 5 years since 2001. And it is recognized as a global standard for assessing trends in reading achievement to measure learners' reading for understanding in their 4th year of schooling, which is regarded as an important transition point in their learning development. Now, Associate Professor in Economics at Stellenbosch University and an education commentator and analyst, Nick Spaull, joins us virtually now to discuss this. Professor Spaull, thanks so much for your time. Welcome to Morning Live.
Thanks for having me.
So firstly, what is your assessment and, your takeout from the report that was revealed yesterday?
So I think the first thing was that we knew that there was going to be a decline as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. So the last time that the assessment was done in 2016, and since then we had the 2020 and 2021 school closures and rotational timetables. So the question was really just how far it was going to set us back. And what we found, what was revealed yesterday, was that we've been set back a decade. It's taken us back to 2011 levels of achievement, and that the average grade 4 child in 2021 was about 80% of the year of learning behind the average South African child from 2016. So those are really incredible learning losses, and at the moment there's no plan to remediate them.
So if we just hone in on what you've just said, because some people would look at this, those who are critical would say, well, it's not a surprise, we expected this. But of course, there are some mitigating factors, or are they enough to actually justify the levels at which we actually performed, would you say, Professor?
Sure. So, I mean, one of the things that we can look at is because there are more than 40 countries that participate in this, and we have 33 countries that had assessments in 2016 and assessments in 2021. So we can see how big the South African decline was compared to those other 33 countries. And South Africa had the largest decline. So not only did we come last of all of the countries that participated, which might be understandable because most of these are rich countries, but we also had the largest decline. And I think what that speaks to is just a lack of any catch-up plans, a lack of remediation, lack of a departmental response of how they would continue learning children in no-fee schools that don't have access to the internet. In the fee-charging schools and the 10% of South African households that have access to an internet connection, you had teachers that would give classes, online classes to those students, that they would send workbooks home, be able to mark, those kinds of things. But if you don't have that, when you weren't at school, you weren't learning. So that's what we're seeing with the study, is this increase in inequality between no-fee schools and fee-charging schools, between English and Afrikaans schools and African language schools. And I think at the moment, the department's response is basically just business as usual. It's just normal schooling. So to answer your question, no, I don't think that there are any interventions that are meaningfully going to catch us up from what we've lost.
And then, if we look a little closer at what these results tell us, so you have grade 4 learners who were assessed across 11 official languages. Grade 6 learners were assessed in English and Afrikaans. Now, the results then show that grade 4s actually cannot read for meaning, and that stat has increased from 78%, as you mentioned, in 2016 to over 80% in 2021. If we were to break that down, let's first start with what some of the mitigating factors could be here. If you look at some of the responses to our question of the day, someone mentioned there perhaps things like the teacher-learner ratio, which is perhaps impossible in some instances to get any sort of quality education across. You spoke about a few of those factors, but if we were to come up and mitigate for the department in this instance, what could we say?
Sure. So I think the example that you gave of large class size is an important one. So what we've seen over the last 10 years is that teachers' salaries have been increasing faster than inflation and faster than the education budget. So even as we've had increasing enrollments children that are coming into school, there was a birth surge in South Africa in 2004, and those children are now inside the schooling system and working their way through the schooling system. We haven't actually hired more teachers. So because we have more students and the same amount of teachers, we're starting to see class sizes edging up and getting higher and higher. And your listeners pointed out that you get these very large classes of 60 kids in some of the more rural provinces. And that's obviously extremely difficult to teach reading in a class of 50 or 60 children. But you also just don't have the types of books that you need to teach reading. The department hasn't provided, they provided the DBE workbooks to every single learner. These are literacy and maths workbooks that every child gets every year, and that's definitely a help. But we've had those workbooks since 2011. I think what we're saying now is we need additional interventions. We need more graded readers, alphabet freezers, storybooks, kind of the types of tools that teachers need to teach reading. Most teachers don't actually have those tools. I think if the department wanted to highlight a mitigating factor, the main one that they would say is that the COVID pandemic was a global pandemic. This had nothing to do with the DBE. It was out of their control. And at the time, it wasn't known whether COVID would affect children, which is the reason why we needed to close schools and operate with rotational timetables so that social distancing could be put in place.
So what was also interesting, if we look at these results, is, of course, the English and Afrikaans schools and, running through the languages and how they performed. And it seems the Afrikaans learners actually performed better. So what can we read into that? What does this tell us, if anything at all?
So you shouldn't read into the change in the English and Afrikaans schools that it went up slightly. So whenever you run a survey that is based on a sample, there's always a margin of error around all estimates. So if something goes up by 5 points or 6 points, we wouldn't necessarily interpret that as an increase. But if something goes up by 20 or 30 points, it's almost surely not because of the sampling error, and it's a real trend. So the way we would describe it is that English and Afrikaans schools did not decline, and they did not go up. They basically performed the same between 2016 and 2021, whereas most of the African language schools, and particularly Setswana, Xitsonga, Indebele, Sesotho, and Sepedi, so these are the languages that are predominant in the northern and more rural provinces in South Africa, had significant declines. In the case of Setswana, the average child was 2 years behind the average Setswana child from 2016. So the other thing you must remember when you're looking at those Afrikaans and English results is that the way that the PIRLS assessment is done is that whatever the language of the school is in grades 1, 2, and 3, that's the language that gets tested when they do the test in grade 4. So children that are learning in a school in English or Afrikaans in grades 1, 2, and 3, those are much more likely to be in fee-charging schools, public or private fee-charging schools. Whereas if you are in an African home language school in grades 1 to 3, it is a no-fee school. So when you're looking at those English and Afrikaans schools, I would also read into that you're looking at wealth as well. You're looking at quintile 5 schools, fee-charging schools, and recognizing that those schools weren't nearly as badly affected by the pandemic as schools in more rural areas and no-fee schools.
So, just to start with what you spoke about in terms of, wiping out gains and putting us back 15 years, essentially. We've been here before with whether it be the 2021 PIRLS assessment results or whether it be, the TIM study as well. We've been here before, Nick. And I'm just concerned about whether we are making significant progress because when it comes to teaching children how to read, for example, when we come down to classroom level and how that actually happens, does that have anything to do with what we ultimately achieve, not only in assessments like these, because we can track this through our own education system as well, where teachers have been complaining about children, even at matric level, who some teachers say cannot read and read for understanding?
Yeah. So I think you're right in locating the problem in the classroom. So I think the way that we need to solve the problem as well is identifying what the teacher is doing in the classroom. Now, in South Africa, more than half of teachers are aged 50 years or older, which means that they were trained under apartheid. the vast majority of the teachers that we have. If you were 50 years and older, it means that you were trained under apartheid. Since then, there's a much better understanding of how to teach reading, what we would call the science of reading. And knowing that this develops from phonemic awareness, understanding the sounds in language, being able to recognize letter sounds, blending and segmenting individual letters and words to create words. Those are all important elements of learning how to read and teaching children how to read. And at the moment, most teachers have not been trained how to teach reading, and they don't have the resources that they need to teach reading. Your question about the trends and whether or not our level of achievement over time is improving. It was improving up to the pandemic. So between 2006 to 2011 to 2016, we did see a slow improvement of children, the percentage of children that could read. But that's now been wiped out. We've set us back a decade because of the pandemic. And I think to summarize this, in my view, extraordinary times call for extraordinary measures. And at the moment, all we're seeing is business as usual. It's just, let's go back to exactly the way that things were and pretend that a pandemic never existed.
Well, I suppose if you listen to the minister's speech, she would argue otherwise. She would argue that, they have tried to make some interventions, make some resources available to schools. The minister also said that, government carries the mandate of providing that quality education, which we are, of course, always debating about the quality of education in our schools. And, of course, from early childhood development up unto secondary education, that debate continues. But Professor Spaull, notably yesterday, Professor Tinyiko Maluleke, who chairs the National Planning Commission, who are the custodians of the National Development Plan, we spoke to him on this show, and they, of course, are responsible for steering the economic development in the country as well. And he told us here on Morning Live that the high numbers of unemployment are also in part due to our substandard education in the country, and that government needs to consciously correct the education system. Now, the question is, do you think that there is enough attention and effort by us in this country to actually pursue that?
The short answer is no. I don't think that there is enough political will or effort from civil society or the politicians that we have to try and reform the education system. So you mentioned that the minister and the DG will talk about the things that they did put in place, the mitigating factors that they did put in place to try and stem the learning losses. Things like remote learning solutions, TV programs, radio, online platforms, virtual classrooms, all of these sorts of things. But it's really important to interrogate and actually go and look into the documents. So if you look at that virtual classroom solution that was announced, that was only in 17 schools. We have 15,000 schools in South Africa. If you look at the television channel, that television channel was meant to target 12 grades and all of the subjects, which means that you've got less than 30 minutes of programming per grade per day. So how do you do that if you have 7 or 8 subjects in a grade? Likewise, the radio channels that existed were only allocated 1 to 2 hours for educational content, and that's for all grades. You do have the biggest initiative that I think the department claims is the Basic Education Employment Initiative, which hired hundreds of thousands of youth. I think it was 400,000 youth at one stage on the PYI, the President's Youth Employment Initiative, and 25,000 of those were reading champions. And that was potentially a really big policy move. But the problem was that they weren't recruited properly. There was no face-to-face training for those youth, which meant that it was basically just an employment initiative. And they were using schools as sites of employment. And yes, they might have been helpful, but you can't just drop an unemployed matric with no training into a school and think that they're suddenly going to improve reading outcomes or stem learning losses. I think basically they were a helpful classroom assistant to cope with large classes and to help the teacher with classroom management. But that's not going to remediate 80% of the year of learning that was lost as a result of the pandemic. So comparing our South African policy response to COVID-19, and you look at international examples from Brazil, from Chile, from the UK, from lots of other countries, there was this huge push to try and make sure that we could catch up learning time, Saturday classes, weekend classes, holiday camps, etc. And what you see, the PIRLS results showing, is that the average South African child is 3 grade levels behind the average grade 4 child in Brazil. Another way of framing that is, in South Africa, only 19% of kids, grade 4 kids, could read at a basic level. In Brazil, that's 60%. So if you're a grade 4 child in Brazil, you have 3 times the chance of learning to read compared to if you're in South Africa. And South Africa and Brazil have the same GDP per capita. We both are very unequal countries. And I think we need to start asking, why is that the case? Why is it that our education system is not delivering what it needs to, even at the most basic level, like teaching children how to read?
And, I suppose in there is some of the answers you've given us along the way. You spoke, for example, about maybe the way our teachers were trained when it comes to subjects such as language, teaching a child to read in a language that perhaps you were not taught to read in, and, that you are grappling with yourself. I would imagine, Professor Spaull, would be, quite a task. And then also, you look at the fact that the amount of money, you also touched on this earlier, where you spoke about teacher salaries and how that has outstripped, inflation. But if you look at that, and we've been told several times that if you take Gauteng as an example, when Panyaza Lesufi was still the MEC for Education, he said that 80% of his budget went to salaries. So, and you would imagine that to be the case all round in the system. So if the majority of the budget is allocated to salaries, paying salaries, what does it leave to take care of some of these other issues, whether they pedagogical or otherwise? How much is left in the pot to do anything else?
Yeah, 80% is also, that's the national average. So in provinces like Limpopo, it's actually more than that. But something that will really shock your listeners, I think, is that the average teacher in South Africa that's employed in a public school is in the top 5% of the income distribution. So if you add up all of the benefits that teachers get, the 13th check, pension, medical aid, housing subsidy, etc., the monthly full-time equivalent that the average teacher in South Africa earns is 42,000 Rand, 668. So it's nearly 43,000 Rand a month that the average teacher gets. So we spend 400 billion Rand on basic education and higher education. And if you just look at basic education, that's about 300 billion Rand, which is 5% of GDP. So we're spending 4% of GDP on teacher salaries. This is an extremely, it's not atypical, by the way. Most countries do spend the majority of their budget, about 80% on teacher salaries. But the problem is when you have a shrinking budget because of fiscal consolidation and austerity, teacher salaries don't go down. It's all the other things that get cut. Money for textbooks, money for training, money for the school nutrition program. All of those kinds of things are seen as much more discretionary than teacher salaries. And if you recall the Limpopo textbook saga from around 2012, if you look at the underlying reasons for that, basically they were taking money from textbooks to pay the teachers. And that's why that whole textbook saga happened, was there was just no money to pay for the textbooks. So I think these sorts of political issues are actually much more complicated than it seems on face value.
Indeed, they are. But just perhaps as a final parting shot, talking about how we fared compared to the other countries that were polled, and we were way below the average, Professor Spaull. What can we do if we were to start trying to catch up tomorrow? Speaking again to, what Professor Maluleke had to say, what can we do tomorrow in terms of low-hanging fruit?
I think the most low-hanging fruit is for the minister to come out and tell us these are the 5 priorities of this education system. And one of them is ensuring that all children learn how to read. Here's the plan, here's the budget. But until you have a plan, which we don't have, and until you have a specific budget to realize that plan, we're not going to see progress.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. But thank you so much for your time and engaging us, Professor Nick Spaull, Associate Professor in Economics at Stellenbosch University, commenting on the poor performance of South Africa's grade 4 learners revealed in the International Reading Literacy Study that assessed comprehension skills. And the study shows that South Africa came last in literacy and comprehension assessment, and of course being set back quite a number of years in terms of the progress that we had previously made.